First, allow me to thank the Tanenbaum Center for Jewish Studies for the invitation to speak to you tonight. When I received this invitation, I looked up Joseph Lebovic. This man's record of achievement and giving humbled me, and I'm not humbled easily. So it's not just a pleasure to be here, but it's a privilege. I'd add, too, that the Tanenbaum family has also been a generous supporter of Shalem College, where I am, as mentioned, President Emeritus. So it's a double privilege for which I'm doubly grateful. This year is the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, 70 is one of those numbers that has a hold on the imagination, as any reader of the Bible knows. It doesn't have a particular hold on me. But like many historians, I see anniversaries as opportunities to remind people of what they've forgotten and perhaps instruct them about things that they've never known. Now, 2017 gave us a string of anniversaries, important ones. The centenary of the Balfour Declaration, 1917. The 70th anniversary of the UN Partition Plan of 1947. The 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War, 1967. And all of these anniversaries generated a great deal of new research, new insights. I myself wrote major essays about 1917 and 1947, and now we've come upon this year's 70th anniversary of Israel, and I'm devoting my writing this year to that year. And as the weather warms, I'll be warming to some of the topics. In fact, I'll be giving a lecture series in New York in July on Israel's Declaration of Independence, by which time I'm hoping all the snow will have melted. But we're still at the beginning of the year, so I'm sharing with you preliminary thoughts. These are preliminary thoughts. This is a work in progress, not a final product. So this is an excellent time to give me feedback, which I can incorporate in my final product. Now, the events of 1948, like those of any great year of independence, are remembered selectively and sometimes encrusted with myths. This is especially so when independence is combined with war. Two processes unfold simultaneously: state formation and war making. And there's no more potent combination for confused chronology and exaggerated claims than this combination. Israel is a prime example of independence combined with war. And naturally, the war preoccupied Israel's leaders. It also preoccupies historians. The most important histories of 1948 are military histories. Think of Benny Morris. His book, 1948, is a military history above all else. Indeed, its subtitle is The First Arab-Israeli War. I myself contributed to this military history a few years ago. Truth be told, I'm not a military historian. I was trained, as mentioned here by Bernard Lewis, in the history of Islam. But in 2014, I read Ari Shavit's best-selling book, My Promised Land, and especially its most celebrated chapter on the Israeli conquest of Lydda in July 1948. His account seemed to me totally contrived, so I wrote a refutation of it. I ended up in an exchange lasting 2 rounds with Benny Morris, which you'll find featured in my latest book, The War on Error. And one of the things I discovered in the process is that it is easy to distort the history of 1948 and to get away with it. Who among the historians of 1948 openly questioned Ari Shavit's account of Lydda? He went from prize to prize, including the National Jewish Book Award for History. Let me add also that in Israel itself, vulnerability to fake history is growing ever deeper. The humanities in Israel are in a free fall, to judge from a new report by Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics. In 1984, which is about when I came to Israel, 23% of undergraduates studied in the humanities. Today it's about 8%. And while Jewish studies seem to be holding up, not so the Israel-specific departments, such as Hebrew literature or Israeli history. In fact, since 1984, while Israel's population has doubled, the number of students majoring in the history of Israel has dropped by more than half. And I see the results. I sense a decline in general knowledge of Israeli history among younger Israelis. It's just a statistical fact that they're much less likely to be corrected by a teacher or a parent or a peer really knowledgeable about history, which leaves them vulnerable to historical misrepresentations and gross errors. And that's why I decided, in the wake of this book, that I'd make more of a difference in the study of Israeli history than in the study of contemporary Islam, at least for the time being. And this year my focus is 1948. Now I mentioned that 1948 is largely the preserve of military historians probing Israeli military decisions. I found that there's much less about the politics. What I'd like to do in my remarks today is to examine 3 instances associated with votes that show the politics of 1948 in a different light. Now, I've called this talk 3 votes. We've just come off the anniversary of the vote, the 1947 General Assembly vote for the partition of Palestine. One of the remarkable things about that vote is that it took place in front of the cameras. If you go onto YouTube, you can see the vote and the roll call of the different countries as they cast their ballots. Of course, a lot took place behind the scenes, which has to be reconstructed through historical research. I myself, in November, I published a long essay about the Soviet role in the 1947 partition plan and the vote, something that's been forgotten. But we also have a filmed record of that vote and a precise accounting, at least, of who stood for what. Regarding the votes taken by the Zionists themselves, there's a lot more confusion. We have to work from deficient minutes of meetings and cut through layers of legend and spin. But I want to present to you today the story of 3 votes by Jews, which were just as crucial to the formation of Israel as we know it, as any vote by the United Nations. The UN vote, we may say, licensed a Jewish state, but the votes by the Jews determined its form. Let me briefly list the 3 votes, and I'll then discuss them in chronological order. The first took place on May 12th, 1948, 2 days before Israel's declaration of independence. The standard story is that there was a vote in the People's Administration. Here you see a photograph of those assembled in the People's Administration, Minhelet Ha'am, it was called, which was a kind of proto-cabinet. You know, in the lead up to the creation of the state, there was Minhelet Ha'am, which was a kind of government in waiting, and Moetzet Ha'am, which was the Knesset in waiting. And the decision was whether or not to declare independence. Now, the evidence, as we'll see, for such a vote even taking place is questionable. However, another vote did definitely take place at this session. It was decided not to delineate the borders of Israel in the Declaration of Independence, a decision that carried by only 1 vote, 5-4. This proved to be crucial. Although Israel was licensed to come into being according to a map, the UN partition map, and we'll see it in a moment, its founders decided that that map wouldn't bind them. And as we'll see, this was a win for David Ben-Gurion. The second vote took place on September 26, 1948. We're already closer to the end of the war. And we're in the cabinet of Israel's first provisional government. You see it here. The question now is this: where should the IDF stop? By this time, it possibly had the military capability to occupy all of Jerusalem and the West Bank. In a narrow vote, 7-6, the cabinet decided to rein in the IDF and stop. This too was a crucial decision. It left the old city of Jerusalem in Arab hands and left Israel with that long and problematic green line demarcating the separation between the West Bank and Israel proper. As we'll see, this was a vote shrouded in some mystery, and its consequences would be a source of regret to many. Ben-Gurion would later describe that vote as a lament unto the generations, bichya ledorot. Now I'm going to confess to cheating. The third vote didn't take place in 1948. It took place in the Israeli cabinet on December 11th, 1949. By now, Israel has reached armistice agreements with its enemies, establishing armistice lines. You see the line as it ran through Jerusalem. Jewish West Jerusalem is included in these lines, but Jerusalem is not the capital of Israel. The government and the Knesset meet in Tel Aviv. But as 1949 draws to a close, the United Nations General Assembly passes a resolution to reassert the provision in the 1947 partition plan that Jerusalem should be a corpus separatum, an internationally administered zone. Israel's government counters with a decision, only one member dissenting. Jerusalem is declared the capital of Israel. Ben-Gurion drove this decision, and as I'll show, it has undeniable parallels to President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Now, why is this history important? By the spring of 1948, the creation of the Jewish state couldn't be stopped. How it would fare in war was an open question, but there would be a Jewish state. But the question was, where would it be? There was a legitimizing framework for the state, the 1947 partition plan, and a map that came with it. But this wasn't the map the Zionists drew. It was a chessboard map, as you can see, made by an international committee. And it excluded Zion, Jerusalem, from the Jewish state. You see that little area there? It's the international zone. Should Israel adhere to it? Alter it? And if so, how? The votes that answered these questions created the realities on the ground that Israelis live in today. What's remarkable is that the first two votes, those of 1948, were decided by the narrowest of margins. It's a reminder that history is made up of choices, but also sometimes just of luck. So we come to our first case. The British preparing to evacuate Palestine. May 12th, 1948, and the People's Administration convenes in Tel Aviv. By the way, they convene, Mr. Lebovic has assisted the Keren Kayemet in the Keren Kayemet building that's in Tel Aviv, which now has a small museum to remember the time when this administration convened there. You have all the leaders of the mainstream parties there. Not the Polshim, not Begin and so forth, but the mainstream parties are all represented. Let's recall the context of events. The previous year, Britain announced that it would be leaving Palestine. It turned the whole question over to the United Nations. In November 1947, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution by a two-thirds majority in favor of partitioning the country into Jewish and Arab states. The Yishuv, at least most of it, celebrated, because since the time of Herzl, of course, the creation of a Jewish state had been the objective of political Zionism. Palestine's Arabs, supported by the Arabs elsewhere, rejected the resolution. Beginning then, November 1947, a civil war breaks out. The British are still there, but a civil war breaks out between Jews and Arabs, even as the British are preparing for their final departure, which they set for May the 15th. Now, the fighting alarmed many people in the international community, and the alarm grew when the Arab states said that on May 15th, they would invade the country to assist the Palestinian Arabs as soon as the British were gone. So a regional war now seemed likely. And so by the spring of 1948, some of the governments that had supported the partition plan began to backtrack. And the most important of these governments was the United States. The estimate of the Pentagon and of the CIA at the time was that if the Arab states invaded, that they would defeat the Yishuv. It might take time. It might take a year. It might take 2 years. But ultimately, they would prevail. And the United States would then come under political pressure to intervene to save the Jewish state. Better than to stop this deterioration by foregoing partition and putting the country under a UN trusteeship, which would have been basically a new version of the mandate. The League of Nations was finished. Now we have the UN. The trusteeship would be a UN version of the mandate. First, there would be a UN-implemented ceasefire, and then a trusteeship administration. In short, the mandate would be prolonged and a Jewish state deferred. This was the US position from March 1948, March 1948 onwards. And the United States made this position quite clear to the leaders of the Yishuv, as well as to its American Zionist supporters, right up to the eve of British departure. Here we see U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall and Israel's shadow foreign minister, Moshe Shertok. On May 8th, remember, May 15th is the end of the mandate. I talked about a vote on May 12th. We're on May 8th in Washington before that. Shertok goes to Washington, and Marshall gives him a talking to. He acknowledges that up until that point, Jewish forces have had a string of victories. He was right. The Jews had taken territory, the territory not only allotted to the Jewish state, but already some of the territory allotted to the Arab state. But Marshall dismissed this as what he called a temporary success. And he warned Shertok that in the longer term there was, as he said, no assurance that the tide might not turn against the Jews. And I quote Marshall, as he himself described that conversation. He says, "I told Mr. Shertok that they were taking a gamble. If the tide did turn adversely and they came running to us for help, they should be placed clearly on notice that there was no warrant to expect help from the United States, which had warned them of the grave risk which they were running." End of quote. So Marshall's message was, don't risk everything, postpone your state, accept a ceasefire. If you go ahead with your gamble and you lose it, don't expect salvation from us. Now there's a story that many in Israel and elsewhere believe that this plunged the leaders of the Yishuv into doubt, that they were frightened by the prospect of defeat, and that they wavered. After all, until now they'd only faced Palestinian militia, right? Disorganized villagers. If they declared a state, they'd face an invasion by Arab states such as Egypt, and Transjordan, and Iraq. These had conventional armed forces, and they'd been armed and they'd been trained by the British over many years. The Americans were proposing a ceasefire. Perhaps it would be sensible to accept it and postpone the state. According to the same story, it was David Ben-Gurion who beat back the doubters, and only just barely. I call this the Moses narrative of the birth of Israel. The people of Israel have been told to leave Egypt, but they hesitate. They doubt. Aren't the risks too great? What if the sea doesn't part? Isn't the desert perilous? Isn't the promised land inhabited by giants? It's Moses who bucks up the people of Israel single-handedly. So let's see how the Moses narrative became inserted in the story of Israel's independence, in particular the May 12th meeting of the People's Administration. Now I'm going to introduce you to someone that you've probably never heard of. Have a look at this photograph. Of course, you see Ben-Gurion on the left, alongside someone who is holding up Israel's freshly signed Declaration of Independence. So who is this man? His name was Ze'ev Sharf. He was a secretary to the agencies involved in transitioning to the state. He became Israel's first cabinet secretary, and later he would become a government minister. And Sharf's job as secretary was to keep the minutes of meetings. And it was Sharf who kept the minutes of the meeting of the People's Administration on May 12, 1948. And later, they served as the basis for a chapter in a book that he published in 1959 on the birth of Israel. And there's a translation into English, and it's called 3 Days. Now, for years, this account was the inside source for the history of what happened in that historic meeting, which lasted for 11 hours until past midnight. It is a fascinating account, which more or less tracks the minutes he took of the meeting. Lots of issues were discussed. I can't cover them all now. Jerusalem was under siege, and much of the debate focused on the city. About 2 members of the People's Administration couldn't even attend the meeting because they were in Jerusalem, which at the time was cut off from Tel Aviv. Certainly the most dramatic moment came when Yigal Sukenik, who was later Yigal Yadin, the famous archaeologist and general, gave the meeting his estimate of the military situation. At the time, he was chief of military operations for the Haganah. He would later become chief of staff of the IDF. He assessed that if the Arab armies invaded, the new state would have a 50-50 chance of surviving. He said he'd be happier if the end of the mandate were 2 months away instead of 2 days away. Yadin would later say that he thought that 50-50, that was actually an upbeat presentation. Golda Meir remembered it otherwise. Ben-Gurion then made a compelling analysis of the risks of delay. A state, he said, could be much more effective in mobilizing the war effort. It could issue orders, not just implore. It could take advantage of the present disorganization in Arab ranks, and so on. Now, Zev Sharf, the secretary, wrote in his book that after this marathon session, and I quote him, I'm quoting him, a vote was taken. It was decided by 6-4 to reject the proposal for a truce. That was the framework. So because if there was no truce, then you'd go on to declare independence. To reject the proposal for a truce. Acceptance would imply postponing the declaration of the state. Rejection by the raising of hands meant ipso facto that in 2 days' time the state would come into formal being. So we're all on the same page here. 6-4 vote against the truce, which meant ipso facto the state comes into being. And this is the account that has gone down as the standard version. It went into the canonical Sefer Toldot Hagana, thousands of pages, published in 1972 onwards, which is the most considered to be the most canonical account of the war. And then it became an assumed fact. At about the same time, it was dramatized in Dan Kurtzman's Genesis, 1948. Some of you may be familiar with that book. I would describe it as history in the remaking. I'll give you a flavor of his treatment with this passage. And now we will vote on whether to accept the armistice proposal, Ben-Gurion declared. Had he made them understand? Could they hear the whispers of the faint-hearted millions who had perished? Desperately he tried to exclude from his own mind the stuttering, painfully revealing ambiguity of the testimony of his military experts, end of quote. So Kurtzman had these amazing powers. He could actually enter Ben-Gurion's mind. In much more restrained form, the story appears in the New Encyclopedia of Israel and Zionism. It's in Amud HaEsh, which is the documentary series on Israel's creation. It's on the website of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. The late Shabtai Tevet, a biographer of Ben-Gurion, he was my dear friend, repeated it at length. Walter Lacour, another friend, includes it in the history of Zionism. It's been repeated by yet another friend, the historian Ilan Troen. I quote him, Ben-Gurion had to apply the full force of his personality and position to achieve this slight majority in favor. It was clearly his influence that made the difference at this critical moment in Jewish history. The duration of the meeting and the closeness of the decision reflected the reality that declaring an independent Jewish state, however deeply desired and justified, was a prospect that engendered great foreboding. The great foreboding, end of quote. The late historian Tzvi Tzahor, is the founder of Michlelet Sapir, the Sapir College, went the furthest, claiming that of the 10 members of the People's Administration who attended the meeting, 9 entered the room disposed to accept the ceasefire and to postpone the state. Only Ben-Gurion thought otherwise, but in the course of the day, he turned this around into 6 in favor of his position. And finally, the most recent example from a very fine book by my own colleague, Daniel Gordis, his Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. And Danny writes, and I quote him, by a slim margin of 6-4, the People's Administration voted in Tel Aviv on May 12, 1948, to declare the first sovereign Jewish state since Judea had fallen 2 millennia earlier. End of quote. Sounds very dramatic. After all, if one vote had shifted, right, you would have had a tie. And then what would have happened? But there's a problem. If you read the minutes, you'll find that there isn't the mention of a vote. Now, obviously, the minutes of an 11-hour meeting won't include everything that was said. Sharf included what he thought was important. But the plain fact is that the vote isn't there. Notice that Sharf, and I quoted him earlier, didn't say who voted for and who voted against. Right? Historians have filled in the blanks on the basis of lore or how they think the members would have voted, but they've not reached identical conclusions. The story is also absent from places where you would expect it to be present. Ben-Gurion's diary doesn't mention it. As we'll see, he mentioned another disagreement among the members, but as for declaring independence, his entry is very laconic. I quote him, "In the afternoon, a meeting of the People's Administration, it was decided to declare statehood and a provisional government at 4 in the afternoon on Friday." That's it. Chertok, in his diary, said the decision not to delay was unanimous, no split vote. In 1969, a then young historian, Mordechai Naol, wanted to clarify who voted which way. So he wrote to Ben-Gurion. And this is the answer that the old man gave him, and I quote him. "In the protocols in my possession, there is no such resolution, and I do not know on what basis you believe that 6 voted against it and 4 in favor. Therefore, I cannot tell you the names of those who voted against and those in favor, because there was no vote, according to the material in my possession." End of quote. In 1973, the Encyclopedia Judaica appeared, and the entry on the Declaration of Independence was written by David Ben-Gurion. There's no mention of the vote, although there's mention of another vote that I'll come to immediately. The preponderance of evidence began to point to the possibility that there had been no vote, that Scharf had made an error in recalling events 10 years after their occurrence. Here he is. One historian finally went to Scharf and pointed out that no vote appeared in the protocol. According to that historian, and I quote him, "Scharf was astonished and at a loss when he discovered he had erred. We discussed this a few times without reaching a solution, but when I found a reasonable explanation and asked to present it to him, he fell ill and died shortly later. A great loss." End of quote. So today, if you now visit Independence Hall on Rothschild Avenue in Tel Aviv, which is preserved as a museum, the explanatory brochure that's on sale notes the controversy, and its author, who is a prolific historian, then adds, and I quote him, "I wish to add my own humble voice to those who deny that any vote was taken." Yeah. Now, why wouldn't there have been a need for a vote? Perhaps because it was obvious that the Arabs wouldn't accept the ceasefire or truce anyway. Because the public waited in expectation of a state. Because fear of a legal vacuum at the end of the British Mandate. Because Menachem Begin threatened to declare a state, right, first, if Ben-Gurion didn't. And because Chertok understood from others in Washington and in New York that Marshall's warning wasn't America's final word, right? And that Truman was more favorably disposed towards an Israeli declaration, which turned out to be true. In the end, even though some members of the People's Administration were alarmed by the situation, the military situation, they didn't have an alternative path forward. So there wasn't a need for a vote. Yes, there was discussion, there was concern, but there was no wavering. The Moses narrative, with Ben-Gurion in the starring role, developed later, over time, along with Ben-Gurion's ascent to mythic status after 1948. But as we see, it rests on a shaky foundation. Now, the real choice the People's Administration did face was what sort of state to declare. Would it be a state in the framework of the UN partition plan? That would be the most legitimate form, the most likely to win recognition. But then, if it was in the UN framework, that would mean accepting borders according to the partition plan. On the other hand, if the state was created only on the basis of the UN partition plan, that would leave maximum flexibility. The question then was whether or not to delineate the borders of Israel in the Declaration of Independence, which was to be made 2 days later. Here, Ben-Gurion was adamant. The UN, by doing nothing to implement its plan, and the Arabs, by declaring war on Israel, had torn up the map. And I quote him, "We accepted the UN resolution, but the Arabs did not." This is what he said in the minutes to the People's Administration. "We accepted the UN resolution, the Arabs did not. They are preparing to make war on us. If we defeat them and capture the Western Galilee," which is supposed to be part of the Arab state, "or territory on both sides of the road to Jerusalem," supposed to be the Arab state, "these areas will become part of the state. Why should we obligate ourselves to accept boundaries that in any case the Arabs do not accept?" End of quote. The United States, he pointed out, hadn't defined its borders when it declared independence. It was this vote that Ben-Gurion always mentioned as the crucial decision of May 12th. The vote does appear in the minutes, right, as 5-4 against delineating the borders. In that Encyclopedia Judaica article, Ben-Gurion also names those who opposed him, and he adds, and I quote him, "By a 5-4 majority, it was decided not to specify frontiers." So, this is the vote on May 12th that made Israel. As Scharf wrote, it meant that if the state were to be brought into existence by force of arms, then its putative frontiers would have to be determined by the same means. That meant that Israel would claim every territory it had conquered in any territory that it would conquer. It was Ben-Gurion who determined that Israel would be a state without borders, and by invoking the American example, hinted at future expansion. And this brings me to the second vote. On September 26, 1948, as I said, by this point, Israel clearly has the upper hand in the war. This is roughly the area that Israel controlled at the time. There's presently a pause in the fighting. The question is in what direction Israel should press its advantage once the fighting resumes. At this point, the IDF still hasn't taken the Negev, as you see. They have a bit of the northern Negev, but they haven't gone all the way. The Negev, by the way, was allotted to the Jewish state in the partition plan. Egyptian forces are still there. Pushing them out will require a major effort. But there's another possible direction, eastwards. Earlier, the Arab Legion had repelled repeated Israeli assaults on Latrun. Well, you can see this is the area here, right, on the way to Jerusalem. They had taken the old city of Jerusalem, including the Jewish quarter. But perhaps this time around might be different. On September 26, Ben-Gurion went to what was then the provisional government to propose another assault on Latrun. But it would be more than that. As part of this campaign, and I quote the minutes, I quote Ben-Gurion from the minutes, "It would be possible to move the eastern central border much deeper, if not past the mountain crest," right up here. I don't see, well, the mountain crest, as you know, is here. Then if not past the mountain crest, then at least up to it, so that the coastal strip won't be so narrow. We can move the Jezreel Valley very much further south, if not to Nablus, and we can widen the corridor to Jerusalem, at least to Ramallah, so that the line from Bir Nabala to Ramallah will be in our hands. In other words, to open up this entire corridor. Now, it's not clear from this just how far Ben-Gurion was prepared to push, but even in this limited conception, much of the West Bank would have been absorbed into Israel. But the proposal met stiff resistance from several key members of the cabinet. They fretted that another attack on Latrun would fail. There was also a lot of international condemnation of Israel because Count Bernadotte, the mediator, had been assassinated by the Polshim, as they called them, 9 days earlier. So Israel would be punished internationally for pressing the war still further beyond the partition borders. That it would put many more Arabs, some of them already refugees, under Israeli rule. So when the proposal was put up for a vote, Ben-Gurion was turned down, rejected, 7-6. One of the 7 against was Shertok, who had to leave the meeting before the vote, so he left a piece of paper with his vote on it. Now, historians have been perplexed by this outcome. Usually when Ben-Gurion really wanted something, he did the groundwork and came up with a practical plan, and he lobbied the main actors in advance. In this case, he did nothing. And this has led to speculation that he himself was of two minds about the plan. And it isn't difficult to list the possible reasons for hesitation, in addition to the ones raised by his opponents. Had Israel moved to take the West Bank, it might have provoked the British to come to Transjordan's defense. It would have certainly undermined any understandings with King Abdullah, although there's debate as to whether such understandings ever held. And the addition of many more Arabs would have threatened Israel's Jewish majority, although in 1948 they might have fled. But there are two interesting twists to this story. After 1949, when the armistice lines were settled, a growing chorus in the IDF held that an opportunity had been missed in 1948. The so-called Green Line was long and porous. Israel's heartland was vulnerable to cross-border attacks, prompting retaliatory escalation. And of course, Jerusalem became a city divided by barbed wire, while the Jews were denied access to their holy places. Yigal Allon, as a former commander of the Palmach, made the most insistent criticism of the way the war ended. Here, let me quote him. This is 1950 or 51 from Sefer HaPalmach, which was the book documenting the triumphs and achievements of the Palmach War. He's talking about 1948. Our main failure was in stopping some of our offensives prematurely and in not initiating additional and crucial military operations. This was especially true with regard to the final stage of the war, when we had the opportunity to annihilate our enemies, earn the right to Greater Israel, and still be able to reach a lasting peace under ceasefire agreements. All of these were within the reach of the IDF at the time. Major diplomatic difficulties caused our government to retreat from fighting for Greater Israel and widening the current not quite borders, leaving the enemy in military bases within the land of Israel. But the consequences of those political and diplomatic considerations placed Israel in apparent and permanent danger. All too often, one might worry whether we won the battle and lost the peace. End of quote. We tend to look at 1948 as this great triumph of the few against the many. You have expressions of regret that it didn't end with Israel in possession of the Greater Israel. And this is Yigal Allon, a man of the left in 1950. Well, this is, of course, a very biting criticism of the way the war ended, and Allon wasn't the only one to make it. This is Ben-Gurion and Chertok, later Sharet, by the way, in case you didn't know. Now, Ben-Gurion, of course, was the target, the implied target of this criticism, and it stung him. And sometimes he dismissed it. Israel didn't need more territory. It needed to focus on absorbing immigrants, building the country. But at times he did express regret that East Jerusalem remained in Arab hands, and sometimes emphasized that he wasn't to blame. He'd proposed to take the West Bank, but he'd been thwarted by others, above all, Chertok. Now, I mentioned Chertok earlier. He was Ben-Gurion's rival in Mapai, their shared political party, and while they'd worked together well in the earlier years, by the 50s they were at loggerheads. Ben-Gurion much later even described the failure to take the West Bank in 1948 as one that would be lamented for generations, for which others were responsible, above all, Chertok. The other twist is that Chertok was known to have said that if he'd realized that his vote would have been decisive, he would have voted the other way. And that while he opposed a large-scale offensive in the West Bank, he would have supported an assault on Latrun, which would have conceivably begun the process, right? So had Chertok stayed for the actual vote, instead of leaving a note, perhaps the outcome would have been different. The vote of September 26, 1948 left a double legacy. It left the West Bank in Arab hands, and solidly Arab, but it also created an Israeli version of the stab in the back, that the politicians had stopped the military from doing what they could and should have done. This fed discontent with the post-1949 status quo, a discontent that came to fruition in 1967, when Ben-Gurion happily declared that the lament of generations hadn't even lasted a single generation. Now, I come now to the last vote. It's a more straightforward case, and I've already laid out the basic parameters. On December 11, 1949, the Israeli cabinet voted to designate Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and the Knesset followed suit immediately thereafter. These are Divrei Knesset with the announcement of the Prime Minister regarding Jerusalem and the holy places. Now, prior to that, as I mentioned, Jerusalem had served as the de facto capital, but on December 9th, 1949, the UN General Assembly had resolved, and I quote, "Its intention that Jerusalem should be placed under a permanent international regime and shall be administered by the United Nations." End of quote. Now, Chertok was foreign minister at the time. He hadn't seen it coming. In Israel, it caused deep consternation. Israel's position in Jerusalem was not recognized by anyone. And Ben-Gurion decided to act decisively by establishing a fait accompli. To keep Jerusalem in Israel, he decided it had to be made Israel's capital. It was a reactive move. There'd been no groundswell of opinion in favor of making Jerusalem the capital. It could just as easily have served as a spiritual capital. There was no necessary expectation that it would become Israel's political capital. The UN move changed that, and the cabinet resolution explicitly described Jerusalem as, quote, an inseparable part of Israel and its eternal capital, end of quote. Now, there was only one opponent of the decision. It was Chertok. He believed that Israel's hold on Jerusalem wasn't in any danger at all. The UN wasn't going to send a force to occupy Jerusalem. Who would come to remove an Israeli policeman on a Jerusalem street? It was Israel's talk of Jerusalem as capital that had provoked the UN resolution. He thought the right thing to do was to act, but to stay silent. After the cabinet and the Knesset voted, Chertok submitted his resignation to Ben-Gurion. First, for having failed to see the evolution of this campaign in the UN, and second, for being unable to defend Israel's policy. But Ben-Gurion ignored the resignation, and he persuaded him to stay on. So this vote set Israel on the path of bolstering Jerusalem. Ben-Gurion mounted a campaign to move Israel's various ministries. They were all in Tel Aviv, to move them to Jerusalem, the capital, including the Knesset, in the teeth of international opposition, including US opposition, by the way. And in retrospect, there's no doubt that naming Jerusalem as Israel's capital strengthened Israel's hold on Jerusalem. If the Jordanians had done the same at the time, making Jerusalem instead of Amman their capital, remember they annexed the West Bank and Jerusalem. If they'd done that, it would have been impossible for Israel to have united the city in 1967, because they would have been taking an Arab capital. Right? But for political reasons, the Jordanians didn't do that, and thus lost Jerusalem altogether. And I'll end this by provoking you by saying that Ben-Gurion showed the way to Trump. Ben-Gurion had acted defiantly in response to a UN resolution over Jerusalem. So did Trump. In his case, it was Security Council Resolution 2334, which the Obama administration declined to veto, and which demanded that Israel, and I quote it, immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Including East Jerusalem, end of quote. Now, the notion that the Western Wall, the Jewish quarter, constituted occupied Palestinian territory alarmed Israel's supporters, Jewish and non-Jewish. Trump at the time was president-elect. Alan Dershowitz wrote, and I quote him, that Trump can ameliorate the effects of this resolution immediately upon assuming office. He can do so by officially recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving its embassy there, end of quote. It's the same logic as Ben-Gurion in 1949. Just as Ben-Gurion reacted to a UN resolution by creating a controversial fait accompli in Jerusalem, Trump has done the same. So you heard it here first. Ben-Gurion and Trump mentioned in the same breath for very limited purposes. What can we conclude from the three votes that made Israel? Notice that they all relate to the possession and status of territory. Now, one could put together another list of important votes, not by politicians, but by Supreme Court justices, which have also had a profound impact on Israel, in particularly in deciding the relationship between the Jewish and democratic character of the state. But the most influential votes by governments have had to do with the territorial extent of the state, and 1948 set three important precedents. First, Israel would claim territory acquired in a war against aggressors. This happened in 1948, happened again after 1967. This wasn't something that emerged from the post-67 settler right wing. It was a principle established in the same very session of the People's Administration, which concluded by choosing Israel as the name of the state. That is, goes right back to David Ben-Gurion. Second, Israel would not claim all of the territory west of the Jordan. This was the principle established by the decision not to occupy all of the West Bank in 1948. And it remains Israeli policy today. But an aspect of that vote actually undermined the principle. The fact that the founder of the state, David Ben-Gurion, championed the losing side. His idea of the missed opportunity of 1948 would fuel the drive to recapture that opportunity after 1967, and that we see embodied in some derivative form in the settlement enterprise. Finally, Israel would respond to every challenge to its hold on Jerusalem by doubling down. Israelis don't see Jerusalem as the Zionist city. I think that's a status reserved for Tel Aviv. But it is Zion. And Ben-Gurion set the precedent for creating facts on the ground in Jerusalem, from the Israeli decision to unite the city in 1967 to Trump's latest move. So the votes of 1948 have had a lasting effect, although reconstructing them isn't entirely straightforward, as you have seen. The amazing thing, however, is that Israel followed democratic procedures from the very outset, even in the midst of a war for its birth and survival. And here I'll allow myself a final personal observation. I mentioned earlier that I came from the study of the Islamic and Arab worlds. In studying those politics, there are no minutes of cabinet meetings. There are no votes to analyze. There certainly are no instances where the leader is overruled by his opponents. Israel may not always make the best decisions, but adheres to best practices in the way they are made. And it's done so since its very birth. There are now many democratic states in the world. There aren't many that have been democratic since their very inception. One may or may not like the precedent set by the outcomes of these three votes, but the precedent set by the process is a valuable one and counts among Israel's most impressive achievements. Thank you very much.